if you go all the way back to the foundations of photography, the very first nature photography was conservation photography. It had that documentary social change motivation.
Thank you so much, Carlton Ward, for joining me today to talk a little bit about your work. Now, you are an 8th generation Floridian. So just to begin, can you just take us back and tell me a little bit about your background of growing up in Florida?
I grew up on the Gulf Coast in Clearwater. My family comes from the Florida heartland. It's a town called Wauchula, and we still have a ranch in a town called Limestone, and that's inland of Bradenton, kind of southwest interior Florida. And so I've seen a lot of changes with my own eyes over my lifetime, but also through the perspective of my grandparents and great-grandparents and beyond, who, through those stories of what it used to be hundreds of years ago.
Now you're focusing on Florida, but you haven't always. So can you tell me a little bit about the work that you did in Africa and what kind of brought you to this decision to focus here in Florida?
Between undergraduate and graduate school, I did an internship with the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and I met some really interesting people in different programs and kind of stayed in touch. And I had a chance to do a subsequent internship with a biological diversity expedition in the country of Gabon in Central Africa. So I went there and ended up working with that program over the course of 3 years. They were discovering species that were new to science and putting together a scientific picture of what was going on in those rainforests, and I was able to use photography to try to showcase and make not just documentation but also art from the different wildlife that they were studying. We had a lot of successes with the work in Africa, and I published my first book, a big coffee table book that had a foreword from the president of Gabon and a foreword from U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, and it was like kind of a nice political, high-profile publication. But then I felt like we were kind of exporting a conservation ethic in a sense, or working to encourage conservation in another place, but meanwhile my home place was disappearing at a rate of 100,000 or 200,000 acres a year to development, and that story wasn't being told. So it was the new perspective and kind of the realization that I can make a difference with photography and storytelling that sent me on a path back home to Florida.
And that's really interesting, I think, because it feels like part of the journey of you even getting here, like you needed to have a little bit of that comparison, right? Like to be in a place where they are putting so much effort into addressing these things. So there's people from all over the world going to places like Africa or India to do this type of work.
Right.
And it's kind of everybody's backyard has something that needs to be addressed.
Exactly.
What did you see maybe through that experience in Africa about the efforts they were making that you've kind of learned from or that you can bring back home here in Florida?
In that time period is where I think got the foundation for my current philosophy of trying to combine photography and art with science for conservation. So ever since then, even though my work's taking me to different places and turned back towards Florida, it's been working closely with science to try to kind of marry the conservation and the journalism with the science.
So can you tell us a little bit about some of the specific projects that you've worked on and why you worked on those in particular? Maybe you can, the Wildlife Florida Corridor, like.
Yes. About the time I moved back to Florida and shifted my focus from Africa back home, I was looking for a project that I could spend 20 or 30 years working on. What can I get involved with where I could potentially make a difference? And I thought about the Everglades because we were just at the beginning of this large-scale Everglades restoration program. And then I also started thinking about Florida's cattle ranches. And for some reason, in my mind at that time, I decided to focus on ranches because that was a lesser known aspect of Florida with great implications for the future of water and wildlife. Because it's those ranches, it's those large agricultural holdings that were being converted to subdivisions and into developments. And people had no idea what was being lost. So I set out on what's been a 12 or 13 year effort now in photographing Florida cattle ranches. So in 2006, I was doing pictures for an annual calendar. And on this one ranch in central Florida, in Highlands County, there were some biologists who were studying black bears. And I was an 8th generation Floridian with a master's degree in ecology who thought I knew a lot about Florida, but I did not know that we had black bears that lived almost entirely on private ranches in this part of the northern Everglades. The same sense of adventure and discovery that I had trying to use camera traps to get leopards in the rainforest of Gabon, I was in the palmetto scrub on the Lake Wales Ridge in central Florida, getting out my camera traps and trying to capture these views of these Florida black bears, which, like the Florida rancher, are ambassadors for protecting these large spaces. But it was a science that kind of informed the storytelling because the researchers are putting GPS collars on the necks of the black bears and watching the way they use the landscape. And this small network of private ranches and orange groves and some public lands in central Florida became a microcosm for the rest of the state because the research showed that these bears were using all of that land and in some cases traveling hundreds of miles throughout the northern Everglades in their search for food and search for a mate and search for suitable habitat. These bears were using basically everything that's green. From the cattle ranch, across the orange grove, across a state park, across an Air Force bombing range, up and through a national wildlife refuge, and it just made that corridor concept seem so real and something that needed to be protected. Any animal, whether it's a bear or a panther or a deer that might want to travel from the Everglades north through the Everglades headwaters has to come through the same section of central Florida. And if we lose that connection, then we're basically cutting off the Everglades forever from the rest of the continent. And so it's a lot falling on those landscapes. So that's what got me involved with the Florida Wildlife Corridor Project. And I was also kind of reacting to some bigger land use and road building plans that were starting to show up at the same time. And just when I was learning about these bears and the way they needed the landscape to stay connected, there was also a brand new highway proposal that would do just the opposite and put new roads and new development straight into this part of central Florida. And as I read through that article and the justifications of the people who wanted to build this road, they talked about every kind of corridor other than wildlife corridors. They talked about transportation corridors, development corridors, hurricane evacuation corridors, but no mention of wildlife corridors.
So do you see, are
exactly.
you seeing that we have the natural infrastructure of the world and the environment, the planet,
right,
and then the infrastructure that we as humans are developing, it looks like it's not in alignment, but is there a way for it to be in alignment? Is this something, do we have, there's maybe people that say that, oh, well, we have to develop, we've got more people in the world and we need to build these things, but is there a way to do it where we are working with the infrastructure that is of nature?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there certainly is a way to live within the context of the natural world, within the natural infrastructure. But especially in Western culture, we have this perceived separation of people and nature and kind of assumes that nature is infinite, nature is there at our disposal, and also kind of ignores the consequences of our actions on that natural environment. It's certainly a challenge, but if we could just reimagine the way we live amongst the landscape, we could set things up in a much more sustainable way. To be more specific, in Florida, if I could set the rules going forward, every new road that gets built cutting across natural habitat in the state would be built like a bridge. We have the technologies now. If you look in an urban area like Miami, when a new highway or new expressway comes in and it's just built on concrete pillars, like a road through the sky. If we built roads like that, cutting across natural habitat, you would have the flow of water and the flow of movement of wildlife unimpeded and unaffected by roads which are ultimately hard barriers. we have to think about the air we breathe and the water we drink and the footprint of our economies, our individual behaviors on the bigger landscape. And from what all the science is telling us, our footprint is way too big. And that means there are going to have to be some hard changes in changing our economies, changing our resource consumption, changing where we build and how we build.
Well, it's interesting you say that as well, because we just had Hurricane Irma.
Right.
And then at the same time, I speak to people around Miami who are investing in more development. So this idea of it, in my perspective, I kind of look at Miami, Florida as like a ground zero in the USA. And if we've got to the point where there's these hurricanes that are very, very strong threatening us, and in the same breath, people are still going ahead with their development plans, and also I think it's a lot to do with the transitionary nature over here of people coming and going, to have like a mindset of like, oh, well, we can flip it in 5 years, or there's a lot of money to be made, or, I didn't expect to hear people still wanting to develop at the same rate post our little hurricane season that we've just had. And it seems to have not really made much of a difference. So I don't know how much more tangible it can kind of get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the human memory is incredibly short when it comes to guiding our decisions. Just like you said, we have these hurricanes, but we keep building with the same exposure. And the pressure for financial gain is so strong that it tends to win out in the decision making in the end. And so, yes, in 50 years, these places might be underwater, but if things go along like they are, in 10 years, they can make a lot of money doing what they're doing. And so those market forces tend to be more powerful in people's minds than taking the really long-term view. And that's been Florida's challenge over the decades, really. They've been selling an acre of swampland to someone in the north for a long time, and the same story tends to repeat itself.
Can you go into a little bit about the changes that you've seen? So how you said you've personally witnessed the changes, and then if you speak with your parents, grandparents, and so on, then you can see the changes even wider. Can you tell us a little bit about that for Florida?
The biggest change I see through my own eyes is the loss of land to development. Florida's population growth has been really intense. My dad was born in the 1940s. During that decade, Florida only had 2 million people. Just in the past couple of years, we've surpassed New York as the third most populous state in the country with 20 million people. And the population is projected to reach more than 30 million people over the next 50 years. So with that, and with the nature of our development, which has been sprawling suburbs, we've been losing about 20 acres every single hour to development. If you get to the fringe or you get to the edges of places like Orlando and you were to look at a satellite image over time, it's just the concrete and the human footprint is just spreading itself across the state, and we're losing so much green space so quickly.
With that, the human footprint, can you talk a little bit about what you've seen so you've seen all of this development over the years, but the relationship between the people who are occupying these developments and the environment and nature and animals and, the natural world, let's say, what do you see?
There are a few layers to the relationship between people and the environment here in Florida that I see. On one hand, there's a broad affinity towards the environment because it's part of what brings people here. People move from all over the country and all over the world for the warm climate, to be close to the water. If you were to take a poll, I think it's something like 75% of people want land conservation and support environmentally minded policies and ideas. But on the other hand, our population, which is really transient, most people were born somewhere else. Fewer than a third of people living in Florida were born in Florida. So people's stories, people's identities often trace back to somewhere else. And so you have this affinity towards nature and a general interest in protecting the environment, but on the other hand, not necessarily an identity in what is the Florida environment, what are the challenges, what are the issues, what can I do to help? And they don't know that when they turn on the faucet to get their drinking water, that it's actually coming from the Everglades. or don't necessarily realize the relationship between whether they get that plastic top on their coffee cup and what that has to do with plastic pollution just here in the Atlantic Ocean. It's harder to see the effects of what we do on a daily basis. I often envy places like Colorado where you can be sitting in Denver and look out at the Rocky Mountains at sunset and know that there's this wild place there that has just some intrinsic, spiritual, or just practical value in knowing that that snowmelt is what's going to provide your drinking water. But the Everglades here is out of sight, out of mind. You can't really appreciate or experience these places without getting out of your car and walking out and seeking them out to experience them. Unless you've had a chance to get up in an airplane and fly over it, or get out in a kayak or canoe and paddle through it, you have no idea the scope of these natural systems, the fragility, even just the nature of them.
What do you see as being the real issues right now that in Florida with the climate change? So we have a lot of this development, but how is this changing climate actually really impacting what's happening here on the land in Florida?
So the land changes that I've been describing have been kind of how Florida's been changing from the inside out. You know, how we've been converting and changing of the land. The other big issue is sea level rise and climate change. And I'm just 42 years old, but in my lifetime I've seen changes. There are places, especially along the Gulf Coast, where the palm trees and the oak trees are dying out as the salt water in the sea slowly comes in. And you can paddle rivers around the Chassahowitzka or Homosassa and actually see that boundary where all of a sudden the palm trees don't have their heads on them anymore, and it's these skeletons to what was more of a freshwater environment that's now a salt environment. And so those lines are changing, those lines are shifting. And as we get more and more hurricanes and intense storms, and as the Gulf and the Atlantic start to come up, people are going to start trying to move to higher ground too. And that's going to put even more pressure on the wildlife corridor and on the land that I'm looking to try to protect. It makes the point that we need to act now. We need to act now to protect the green infrastructure and the wildlife corridors that sustain all life here, including people, so that as things do change and people start to move inland, we've at least set aside enough of the green space so that there can be a balance.
What is the trajectory that we're on? Like, where are we headed if we just keep on going the way we're going? So yes, we're building awareness, but we're still also building buildings, and we're also still what is we just keep doing what we're doing? What does that look like?
In terms of land conservation, if we keep developing at the rate we're developing now, with low density suburban sprawl, we're going to consume 5 million acres of rural and agricultural land by the year 2070. And in doing so, we're going to lose the connectivity of the wildlife corridor. We're going to permanently separate the Everglades from the rest of the state and the rest of the continent. We're going to forever isolate the Florida panther and Everglades species to an area that might not be big enough to sustain them. And we're going to put so many hard boundaries on this landscape that we're not going to have the resilience to adapt to new threats like climate change or intensifying storms or whatever new challenge might be over the horizon, because we're going to basically paint ourselves into a corner where we don't have the chance we have right now. This really unique opportunity where what we do in the next 5 or 10 years is going to have a huge influence on the next 10,000 years, whether that's on a local land use level or on a global energy and climate level. You know, we still have enough resilience and enough infrastructure on this planet that if we get it right and we get it right soon enough, we can figure this thing out.
Okay. And do you feel that a lot of the things that need to be done are more of individual behavior in the sense of the general public, or is it more of a policy level thing, or how do we go about making that move that you're describing?
The solutions to habitat loss and the solutions to climate change are both individual and political. There's certainly things that individuals can do better. Choices about transportation, choices about our consumption, choices about the type of communities we want to live in. But in the end, it's also a political problem. And the fastest way to change, for example, our energy policy is to change the policy. To create more incentives for different kinds of energies, to create disincentives for fossil fuels and other sorts of energies. On the conservation front, we know that 75% of Floridians want public dollars spent for land conservation. Mm-hmm. There was actually a constitutional amendment in 2014 called the Water and Land Legacy Amendment. It was Amendment 1 on the ballot. 75% of people voted for it, and it's supposed to spend 1/3 of all the real estate transaction taxes on land protection. But the politicians in Tallahassee, our state's capital, have not allocated that money according to the will of the people. And so in this case, in the case of land protection, the biggest single thing we could do to achieve protection of the corridor is to make sure those politicians respect the will of the people and invest those public dollars into those programs.
Mm-hmm. A little bit more about the photography then that you do now. So can you share a little bit about the International League of Conservation Photographers?
So it was led by Christina Mittermeier, who's a marine biologist and photographer who really felt that the field of nature photography was falling short on its responsibility to bear witness to conservation issues. And through her leadership, about 40 of us who were working in photography and wanting to have conservation influence got together and formed this organization. And it's been really good to kind of unify and bring different photographers together who are working on different issues around the world and look at the common challenges and draw inspiration from one another and trying to make conservation photography a real discipline that photographers would aspire for, but also the conservation organizations would recognize should be part of their conservation planning, parts of their expeditions. There should never be, in my mind, a large-scale expedition to go out into the world to understand science and research without built-in communications from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't have been an anomaly that I was embedded with a group of researchers in Central Africa. That should be normal.
Absolutely.
And I do think that there is an awareness and an evolution of bringing science and communications together, especially in an era of social media where a conservation group or a research group recognizes to be relevant they need to have high impact communications. So that's a good trend, and I think very encouraging to see.
And now your work takes you obviously into the wilderness and interesting people, interesting environments. Can you tell me a little bit about your process and like what are you doing to go and capture these absolutely amazing images?
If I were to describe myself as a photographer, I'm a photographer of place. And so I'm not a wildlife photographer, I'm not just a photographer of people, but I'm photographing a place. And the connections of people to those places often make a really powerful bond between that person and the place, but also strengthen a connection to the viewer. Because people understand and identify with people. Whether it's a Florida cowboy on horseback at dawn looking out over a herd of cattle, or whether it's a fisherman out over the oyster bar tonging for oysters at sunset, like that human character who is connected to that landscape is the powerful draw for me as a photographer, because I think ultimately what I'm longing for, wanting to portray, is that we are connected to these places. And there are people out there still living close to the land. And while those people and those landscapes are dependent on what we do far away from there for their future, people living close to the land are also guardians of those landscapes. And saving those places is not just about saving wildlife for the rest of us or saving water for the rest of us, but it's about protecting a heritage and protecting a relationship that often goes back over generations. And there's real intrinsic value to those connections. And so I'm drawn to the human subject, and especially to these generational connections to the land. And another theme that runs through my work is water. It's not something I've consciously sought out, but if I look back at some of my favorite pictures, there's often water in the frame. And more often than not, I'm standing waist deep in water myself because I'm immersing into this landscape. And the resulting images that tend to rise to the top in terms of ones that people are attracted to have that same quality. You know, it's not like I'm driving by in a boat and snapping a picture. I might be waist deep among the mangrove roots, squatting down, keeping my camera just above the surface of the salt water, waiting for the light and waiting for the clouds to align so that you can kind of capture a moment that represents that space. And so I end up immersing myself, trying to find some image that can kind of bring others along with me. I mean, almost like the goal of photography is really, it's almost to get the camera out of the way and just to kind of be a conduit to that place at that moment in time. You can feel a good picture taking shape when it's happening, and it's not something that you're necessarily predicting or planning, but it's responding to a moment in nature or a moment with a person. And I think that's what gives photography its unique power. It's not the abstract beauty, it's the fact that that's a very specific moment in time that is being captured. Photography functions on a lot of different levels. One is kind of a broad general awareness, but also the role of the photographer as an ambassador working in these landscapes. And I end up becoming, on an individual level, an agent for the change I want to see just by the relationships I personally develop with landowners, with biologists, with people who are stakeholders in the future of these places. And the imagery can be kind of an entry point or a point of excitement to get people talking and thinking about things, but those of us as journalists and artists, you know, ourselves, it's not some disconnected, objective third eye that's looking out of the world. Like, I'm an active participant in these places, personally interacting and working with and trying to be part of these teams and, you know, contributing my efforts locally as well.
Beautiful. Do you have, is there anything else that I know I've jumped around on a few different things, but is there anything that I didn't address that you're very passionate about or you think is very important to be communicated?
I hope my photographs are just kind of a jumping off point, and it's something that can catch someone's interest long enough to read a caption, but then to get excited to get involved with these places themselves. Because pictures are important, but the goal is for people to develop a relationship to these places. And there's no substitute for getting out and walking on these trails or paddling on these waterways and forming that connection for yourself. And I think that will have great influence on our decisions on how we move forward.